Welcome to Vinnie Politan Investigates. I'm Julia Jenaé in for Vinnie, and the subject of our investigation is the Delphi murders. It's a case that shook a small community in Indiana. But now there are some wondering if the man who's accused, if he's the real killer. Here's the story. It was a mystery that broke the hearts of two families, terrified a small community, and touched the world. The murders of two young girls, Abby Williams and Libby German. The case became known as the Delphi murders. The setting, a small Indiana town of just 3,000 people. From the beginning, investigators suspected it was someone local, which made it even more difficult for everyone from this small community. It started on February 13th, 2017, when Libby German and Abby Williams were hiking. The two teenagers were good friends and had the day off from school. The weather was unreasonably warm, but when Libby and Abby didn't show up when they were supposed to get picked up, their families began to worry and they began to search. Then the next day, the bodies of these two girls were found, both victims of murder. Then over the course of the next 5+ years, there were no answers, no arrests, just a series of disjointed clues, like two sketches that looked nothing alike, a video of a suspected killer, and a short audio recording of his voice. Then things got even stranger when police said they were looking for anyone connected to an Anthony Shots social media account, which was not connected to the male model in the photos, but connected to this man who was arrested for child porn. Then the arrest of Richard Allen for the murder of the girls, someone who was not on anyone's radar, someone no one had ever mentioned as the suspect or person of interest. And now prosecutors say he is the Delphi killer. It took 5 long years before investigators announced the biggest break in their case, the arrest of Richard Allen. He was charged with 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of felony murder. And prosecutor Nick McDonald addressed this in his opening statement, saying, quote, "For 5 years, Richard Allen, lived in this community. He worked in this community, hid in plain sight." The tight-knit community of Delphi was stunned by the arrest, and the idea of a cold-blooded killer living among them, working at their local CVS, was shocking.
In October of 2022, surprisingly, we got word that there was an arrest.
What? Disbelief. Like, okay, I'm hearing this, but it's a process.
Like the rest of national media, I showed up to watch that press conference to announce the arrest, not knowing what to expect.
Today is not a day to celebrate, but the arrest of Richard M. Allen of Delphi on 2 counts of murder is sure a major step in leading to the conclusion of this long-term and complex investigation.
We expected to be excited and happy and overjoyed that he's arrested, but now we're dealing with understanding that there's a lot of reopening wounds that's coming with that.
My name's Dan Semitovich. I'm the producer and co-host of Down the Hill, the Delphi Murders podcast. My first reaction, I think everyone's first reaction, was, who? We had no idea who this was.
Richard Allen, you child murderer! Why did you do it? Shame on you!
My name is Nicholas McClellan. I'm the Carroll County prosecutor. Mr. Allen has had his initial hearing. He's entered a preliminary plea of not guilty, and he is in custody. He's being held currently without bond.
Here comes a guy that has never, ever been announced. He was nobody's radar. It was like, where did this guy come from?
Richard Matthew Allen was 50 years old, had no criminal history, and worked as a farm tech over at the local CVS in Delphi.
I was surprised because he seemed like a real nice guy and everything, waiting on us in the drive-thru and everything.
I had not interacted with him, but everyone knew who he was. I mean, he worked there for so long. And when I found out who it was, I never in a million years thought that it would have been him. Not someone so integral to the community and to the Delphi experience.
And because of this shock, because of the questions that still seem to linger, that leads us to our first question of the hour. Here it is. Did Richard Allen do it? Is he the one that actually committed this crime? Has the cold case been solved? With us to discuss our experts, joining us from Indiana, Court TV senior producer Barbara McDonald and the YouTube live streamer behind the Gray Hughes Investigates podcast. Gray Hughes is with us. It's good to have you both on. Barbara, let me start with you. You are following every detail in this case, and the question is, have the prosecutors been able to prove that it is Richard Allen who has done this? Tell me about the state's openings and how they've laid out this case.
They're going based on a timeline that Richard Allen placed himself out at the trails the day the girls went missing, that back in 2017, according to the investigative narrative report that was written, there is no recording of that interview, but the officer who talked to him wrote a report and said that Richard Allen told him that he was out at the trails from 1:30 to 3:30 p.m. that day. That is the critical time when everything happened. Abby and Libby were dropped off at 1:49 p.m. Libby uploaded a couple of pictures of Snapchat, or two Snapchat rather, of Abby on the bridge and a shot of just the bridge at 2:07. And then the video that Libby recorded of the man approaching the girls on the bridge and ordering them down the hill, that happened at 2:13 p.m. Now, the prosecutor is going to be calling on witnesses who will say they saw a man prior to that 2:13 time period who matched the man in Libby's video. And they're going to try to say that that was, in fact, Richard Allen, even though none of the witnesses said that's the guy from CVS or that is Richard Allen. Nobody identified him by name, but they're going to say that there was no other man in the area during that time period. And so it has to be Richard Allen.
And Gary, this is a case where there have been calls for transparency because of some of the rulings in this case. Also, the fact that there aren't cameras allowed inside of the courtroom or any recording devices at all. Was there anything that the state revealed in their opening statement that surprised you or was new?
Actually, it seemed pretty normal. Like, it's the stuff that we've all heard in general. I still think that there's probably some information that they haven't put out there. My belief is that Richard Allen tipped himself in early on to get ahead of it because he saw three girls as he was getting to the bridge that day. He parked his car at the abandoned CPS building after driving by the Hoosier Harvest store. There's a surveillance camera that captures all the movements of different cars, and that was at 1:27, and then he probably parked at 1:29, gets out of his car, and then he passes these three girls. Now, he has this public job, so those three girls, likely, he probably thought in his head later, God, they probably maybe recognize me. Now, it's also possible that he came forward after the first image was released, because they put that image out of the bridge guy about a day or 2 days after the homicides, and he, so it was 2 days after the homicide, so he probably thought, wow, that looks like me. He knows it's him, so he calls the tip line, and then he interviews Dan Doolin, and he told Dan Doolin that he was there from 1:30 to 3:30, and he saw three girls. There was actually four girls. There was one that was like 9 years old also, so there was really four, and they passed him, and he passed them, and they all admit to seeing him. So then he walks to the bridge and goes all the way to the bridge, and then that's where Betsy Blair comes into play, where she sort of narrows down the window even further, where he's right at the start of the bridge at, I would say, about 1:46. He's right there. And then she turns around and passes Abby and Libby, and Abby and Libby run into Richard Allen, or AKA Bridge Guy, at the start of the bridge. So, for me, he's locked in there on the timeline.
Yeah, Gray, you're laying it out the way the prosecution tried to do in their opening statement. And let's take a look at some more quotes from that opening statement. Prosecutor Nick McClellan told this jury the facts as the state sees it. When they get across, he pulls, and they meaning the girls, he pulls out a gun and forces them down the hill. As Richard Allen, does this, the video on Libby German's phone shuts off. Out of fear, the girls comply. And he had the power and the fear and forced down the hill. The last face these girls saw, because their throats were slit, was Richard Allen's face. That's another line from the opening statement. Barbara McDonald, what did you think about the detail that the prosecution used in their opening statement? Do you think they kept it vague, or was it pretty detailed with all of the information they have in this case, laying it out for the jury?
It was a rather short opening statement from the elected prosecutor of Carroll County, Nicholas McClelland. He used about 13 and a half minutes compared to about an hour that the defense used. And I think he was going for a little more of the emotion of what happened and how horrific this was, what happened to these girls and these families and this community. I anticipate he's going to get into a lot more of the detail once we get into the case at large. But I think he was going for more of telling the story. He even said in his opening statement that now we get to tell the rest of the story. For so many years, people have been watching this case and wanting to know more about what happened. And now is the time that we're going to get that information as this trial plays out.
I like that he started with this case is about the bridge guy, the bullet, and the brutal murder. Gray, talk to us about the bullet. It's a big part of this case.
Yeah, I mean, at the crime scene, I think it was like 2 feet away from Libby, but in between Abby and Libby, they found a .40 caliber bullet. And so what's interesting about that is I've known early on, since the beginning, that there was a sound that the police officers believed was a click, or like, you know, chambering a bullet at the end of the bridge, and that's when he had the girls go down the hill. And you know, it's interesting when you think back where on the 2019 press conference where they were looking for the driver of the vehicle that was parked at the abandoned CPS building, and it all came together when they found Richard Allen, and the bullet at the crime scene was found, and it was ejected from it looks like, based on the ejection marks, from Richard Allen's Sig Sauer P226 pistol. So it matches that. Now, there'll probably be, the defense will bring up a witness that probably tries to counter the veracity of that information. But, you know, what's interesting is when Richard Allen had 2 replacement attorneys, one of those attorneys was on a show prior to becoming an attorney for Richard Allen and said how damning the ejection marks were on that bullet. So.
And it is huge evidence there inside of that courtroom. Stand by, because coming up next, we're going to ask the question, did Richard Allen confess to the murders of Abby Williams and Libby German?
Richard Allen, you child murderer! Why did you do it?
Are you incapable of telling the truth, Brian?
On the premiere of Interview with a Killer.
The problem is people don't believe me.
A gruesome torture caught on camera.
You told the police that you shot her because you wanted a Hollywood moment.
The monster behind the memory card murders is speaking out.
That sounds like a guilty man who's coming clean.
Interview with a Killer. Series premiere Sunday, 8/7 Central on Court TV.
Richard Allen, you child murderer! Why did you do it? Shame on you! Shame on you, Richard! You're going to prison for the rest of your life! Shame on you, Richard Allen!
During opening statements in the Delphi murders case, prosecutor Nick McClelland told the jury that one simple fact that they believe proves their case beyond a reasonable doubt. Richard Allen admitted to being there. That's what they say is all that this jury needs to believe, to know that this case, the evidence, it all proves what they have accused this man of. The probable cause affidavit goes even further, saying that investigators reviewing prior tips encountered a tip narrative from an officer who interviewed Richard Allen back in 2017. And that narrative stated Mr. Allen was on the trail between 1:30 and 2:30. While at the Freedom Bridge, he saw three females. He noted that one was taller and had brown or black hair. He did not remember a description, nor did he speak with them. And he walked from the Freedom Bridge to the High Bridge, and he did not see anybody, although he stated he was watching a stock ticker on his phone as he walked. So on top of admitting to being on the trail the day the girls disappeared, the state then claimed that defendant Richard Allen confessed multiple times to killing Abby Williams and Libby German. And this was all while he was being held in the Westville Correctional Facility after he'd been arrested. During a preliminary hearing, a prison psychologist testified that Allen told her he wanted to confess to the killings of the girls. An Indiana State Police detective also testified that Allen confessed more than 60 times, most often to his wife and mother, who reportedly didn't believe him. So all of that gets us to our second question in this investigation. Did Richard Allen actually confess? Let's bring back in our guest, still with us to discuss. Court TV senior producer Barbara McDonald and the YouTube live streamer behind Gray Hughes Investigates. Gray Hughes is with us. Barb, tell me about this confession, because we've heard so much about how many there are and all of these differences. And I know we'll get to what the defense says about them, but why is the prosecution believing these words?
Well, there were numerous confessions that happened after Richard Allen had already been incarcerated for about 4 or 5 months after his arrest. He was placed, rather than being in a county jail, which is typically what happens after somebody is arrested and charged with a crime, he was placed in a maximum security prison, basically in solitary confinement, treated as if he was on death row, essentially. And that was for his safekeeping. And he was housed there for the better part of 2 years until very recently, when the judge changed that safekeeping order and allowed him to go to a county jail. But during that incarceration, that first prison that he was at, Westville, he was subjected to very harsh conditions, and he was being treated for psychosis by that same prison psychologist that you had mentioned. She diagnosed him as being psychotic. And even at one point during his incarceration, he was being treated with antipsychotic medications against his will because he wasn't taking them. So he was basically being injected against his will with that medication. And that's sort of what was going on when these confessions were happening. There's about 61 of them. The prosecutor says that some of them do contain information that only the killer would know, and that Richard Allen described to his wife and to his mother that he did it, why he did it, and how he did it.
And Barbara, a follow-up, have they released the information that only the killer would know?
No, we don't know exactly what that information is that they're saying only the killer would know that is contained in these confessions. However, the confessions are going to be admitted at his trial, all 61 or however many there are, at least 61 of them. And the jury is going to be able to hear them because some of them were recorded. We understand that some of them were also written by Richard Allen, and then others were given verbally to various people, to the psychologist, to the warden, to other inmates, to some of the guards, as well as his own family.
Gray, what kind of timeline are we talking about, and what do you think? Did he confess based on what we know?
Well, I think that those medications started after, if I'm remembering correctly, after his first confessions. So what happened, in my opinion, is everything was fine in there. He was reading books, he was exercising, things were going well, you know, as well as they can in a prison, I guess. And he confessed to his wife and to his mother, and his wife actually hung up the phone really quick and was like, "Oh my God," and then called the attorney up. And then after that, miraculously, Richard Allen started chewing paper and drooling on his shirt and doing all these, you know, kind of crazy things. And I wouldn't be shocked at all if some of those confessions that have false information were actually planned to put out there to muddy the waters of the confessions that actually truly have information that only the killer would know. For example, they're saying that Richard Allen was interrupted after going down the hill. So is that in a confession that he mentioned something? And I wonder if law enforcement can verify the thing that he said interrupted him. And I think that's what's going to come out at trial. And I don't know how he's going to get away from that one.
Yeah, Greg, the defense is attacking this confession. They are saying they're not legitimate, and they also talk about what's mixed in. Can you talk about what's mixed in that's a problem? We only have about 30 seconds.
When you say mixed in, what are you
the things that he said that were not true. I believe it was something about his grandchildren.
Shooting, yeah, like, yeah, he mentioned shooting, like they were shot with a gun and various things that are absolutely not part of what really happened. So I think those were planted as, look at, you know, like you throw a bunch of false confessions in there and you try to muddy the waters of the real ones that happened early on. And then all the medications and him acting strangely. And then as soon as he was evaluated by psychologists, I believe after that, he miraculously got normal again. I mean, it was pretty weird how it all just... I think they're going to prove this stuff at the trial, too. I think the prosecution is going to do what I just said right there.
Now, there's a lot more to dig into. Gray Hughes, Barbara McDonald, thank you so much for breaking this down for us. We do have to get to a break. I'm Julia Jenaé in for Vinnie Politan. We'll keep digging for answers as the investigation continues. Welcome to Vinnie Politan Investigates. I'm Julia Jenaé in for Vinnie Politan, and we continue our investigation into the Delphi murders. The true crime community has been closely following this case intensely for 7 years, and now some believe the wrong man has been charged. Here's the story. Teenagers Abby Williams and Libby German were best friends, living in a small rural community of Delphi, Indiana. On February 13th, 2017, the girls had a day off from school, so they decided to go on an outdoor adventure. They were dropped off near the Monon High Bridge. While on that bridge, Libby recorded a man with her phone uttering the words, "It was down the hill where Libby and Abby would be murdered." Prosecutors say that man on the bridge is responsible, and they say that man is Richard Allen. But Allen and his attorneys say prosecutors have it all wrong. They say Allen is innocent, and it was someone else on the bridge that day who took the lives of these two innocent girls. So the defense here, they're saying that there's not the right person in custody, that the investigation didn't go properly, and that the defendant is not the one who is responsible for the deaths of Abby Williams and Libby German.
Bradley Rosie and Andrew Baldwin issued a press release not too long into their getting the case, and they said they believe that Richard Allen is innocent. Do you have an opinion on that?
I do. I don't think Mr. Allen had anything to do with this. I honestly don't. Now, what I believe, nobody cares. My job would have been to convince 12 jurors of that.
You're a defense attorney, so that's your job to sort of say your client is innocent. Is that something you say about all your clients?
No, and rarely do I believe it. But in this particular case, I believe it 100%.
That was a former attorney for Richard Allen, William Libredo. But during the defense, who is representing the accused, in the opening statement, attorney Andrew Baldwin told the jury this: Richard Allen is truly innocent. From the evidence and the lack of evidence, it may be hard to truly believe. Richard Allen was never on the trails with those girls. Richard Allen was gone by 1:30 from the trails. His car is gone by 2:15 p.m. out of the CPS lot. We know by evidence. So that brings us to our next question. What is Richard Allen's defense in this case? What's the jury going to hear about inside of that courtroom in Delphi, Indiana? With us to discuss, joining us from Indiana, Court TV senior producer Barbara McDonald is with us, plus the president of and CEO of the Troeth, largest international organization of heathenry, a practicing heathen and expert on Odinism, Lauren Crow. Barbara McDonald, let me start with you. The defense in this case has tried to get a lot in front of the jury. Tell us what the jury did hear about in terms of the defense in this case and what was not allowed to come in.
Well, they're not allowing that Odinism defense, and that was something that the current defense team, they were the original defense team, and then they were released by the judge, fired, if you will, and then reinstated by the Supreme Court. So there was a period of about 2 or 3 months where they were not, the current defense attorneys were not representing Richard Allen, and those other gentlemen, Mr. Libredo, who I spoke to a couple of months ago, was the interim attorneys. But now we're back to that original team. They initially put out some information in a motion saying that not only is Richard Allen not guilty of these murders, but these other people that had been looked at by law enforcement. And this is information that the defense didn't obtain through their own investigation. They obtained through the discovery, rather, that came from the prosecution in the case, and that there were these other men who had these Odinist ties that law enforcement looked into, that the defense feels weren't fully looked into, that there could have been more done to look at these people, and that there are outstanding questions about these people and their potential involvement in this crime.
All right, before we get Lauren to weigh in, I do want to dig more into this defense that attempted to come in front of the jury, but the judge rather, shut it down. And that's this defense that there was a group of Odinists who were responsible for the girls' murders and that they died as a part of a ritualistic killing. Now, the defense even claimed that guards who were tasked with protecting Allen in prison were open about their beliefs in Odin, and they wore Odinist patches on their prison uniforms, and that one guard even had an Odin tattoo on his face. Take a listen to more of Allen's former defense attorney explaining what they uncovered.
You had not heard of Odinism when it first was floated with regard to this case?
I honestly thought, I was like, no disrespect to Mr. Baldwin and Mr. Rosie, because they're excellent lawyers. I thought it was hocus pocus. I honestly didn't, I'd never heard of it. And the more I got into it, that's a real thing. It is a real thing, and it's scary.
In what way? Well,
I believe they sacrificed a girl and killed another one. Some of the people that live in Delphi were very brazen about their Odinistic beliefs on their Facebook pages and other social media accounts, including the sergeant who was in charge of keeping Mr. Allen safe in Westville. It's real. Just the other day, Robert and I were going to lunch, and we saw a Jeep Wrangler right here in Fort Wayne with a spare tire on the back, and the cover said Odin, and it had all Odin spears like around on the cover. I would have never known what that meant and outside of this case. So Mr. Baldwin and Mr. Rosie were onto something right away.
You described one of those officers that's mentioned in one of Rosie and Baldwin's filings, Sergeant Jones, who was wearing patches that said, "In Odin We Trust," on his Department of Corrections uniform.
Yep.
The judge ordered the warden to make them stop. And then what did you notice?
That Mr. Jones had a tattooed under his right eye. From the best we can tell, it looks a lot like Odin's spear. And he had several tattoos on his forearms, including the interlocking triangles that are on his Facebook post. I got to give credit to Mr. Rosie and Mr. Baldwin that, they picked up on that. We saw him, and, confinement officers at the Allen County Jail aren't even allowed to have facial hair, let alone facial tattoos. I was a little miffed that the warden allowed that, or, he even knew what it was.
Now, this information can be really difficult to digest if you have no idea what this attorney is explaining. Lauren Crow, you are an expert in Odinism. How do you describe it to people who have never even heard the term?
Odinism is a religious gang. Essentially, it was in the United States. Odinism was primarily founded by a woman named Elsa Christensen, who wanted to use Norse pagan flavorings to have a quote-unquote religious group that could meet in prisons in Florida. And something I do want to clear up, because I think this is very important. Not everyone who believes in Odin is an Odinist. I would argue that Odinists are such a small percentage. As a heathen, which is what you call someone who worships the Norse or Germanic gods, I worship Odin. And some of the tattoos he presented, like the one he said was under that guard's eye, that is not a spear. That's called the Web of Weird. Has nothing to do with Odin. Has to do with another god, a group of goddesses called the Norns, and it's all about understanding your place in the world, your fate. It has nothing to do with Odin. The interlocking triangles, once again, are called a Vagosphere. That's the thing he was talking about on the back of someone's Jeep. The interlocking triangles are called a Valknot. They are also a symbol of strength in a warrior. Warriors often put them on as a means to mark themselves as strong and a warrior and someone who's working for good in the world. Are there bad people who use these symbols? Absolutely. Does the Westboro Baptist Church reflect what every Christian does? So I find it highly disturbing that we're going to lump every person, and I've reviewed all these documents, I've looked at these Facebooks. Fact of the matter is, I know what an Odinist is. There were probably Odinists in that prison, because Odinist is a prison gang, is a prison religion. But the guys who they're talking about in Delphi, they're Ossetry or heathen, which is completely different. It's about like saying, oh, well, this group of Methodists did this crime, so let's go arrest the Baptists down the street and the Catholics. I think a lot of people mistake that it's a religion with very varied beliefs, lots of sects. I mean, we're like every other religion. We disagree and we split off. People disagree about all kinds of things. But the important thing to remember is Odinism is a very small sect. It is very racist. It's very violent because it's a prison gang, and that's how prisons operate. And so having spoken with people who work we have a program called InReach where we actually work with prisoners. We're working in 125 prisons and jails and facilities right now in the United States. And none of them have ever heard of an Odinist guard. And in fact, these guards were heathen. They were not Odinists. They were the opposite of Odinists. They were people who were pro-LGBT, who were anti-racist. And so it deeply bothers me that these lawyers, it reminds me of the Satanic Panic of the 1980s, which I lived through as I grew up near West Memphis. So I have firsthand experience with this. I find it very disturbing to paint everyone this broad brush and everyone's an Odinist. To me, it would be like if I saw the Westboro Baptist Church or Al-Qaeda and tried to paint the entire religion with just that very small sect.
Lauren, I appreciate you breaking down that for people because it may be completely foreign to them. And we do have to get to a break, but we are going to talk more about the Delphi murders and the defense that was in front of this jury. So our next question will be, was this investigation botched?
One of the most successful true crime TV shows ever.
This is crazy.
Now has a new home on America's original true crime obsession, 48 Hours on Court TV. Coming up next on Court TV.
The trial of a wife who's accused of killing her husband and then burning his remains.
Defendant murdered and desecrated her own husband.
The Burn Pile Murder Trial. Live coverage weekday mornings, 8, 7 Central on Court TV.
After the bodies of Libby German and Abby Williams were discovered, questions flooded the town of Delphi. Was the killer one of their own? There were several witnesses who claimed to have seen the suspect on February 13th, 2017, and they came forward, giving investigators an idea of who may have killed these two best friends. And there were two sketches that came out of these witnesses telling police what they saw. Sketches of the suspect that couldn't look more different. They were released in 2017 and 2019. And clearly the sketch on the left does resemble defendant Richard Allen, but the sketch on the right clearly shows a younger man. And these two very different images have been synonymous with this case. The state filed a motion asking the court to prohibit these sketches from coming in at trial. Allen's defense team filed this response, saying that, quote, to the extent that the sketches do not resemble Richard Allen, they are highly relevant, and evidence which tends to show that someone else committed the crime logically makes it less probable that the defendant committed the crime and thus meets the definition of relevance. So at the end, Judge Fran Gull sided with the state, ruling that these sketches aren't admissible in court. So that brings us to another question. Many have questioned the vast differences between these two sketches. So we wonder, was this investigation botched from the very beginning? Let's bring back in our guests from Indiana. Court TV senior producer Barbara McDonald is with us, and also joining us now, retired police commander and author of the book Deceived and host of the Profiling Evil podcast, Mike King is with us. Barbara McDonald, talk to us about these sketches and why they aren't coming in. I know the judge ruled that they are out, but what was her reasoning?
Her reasoning was she sided with the state, who said these were simply investigative tools that were used, and they were never used to identify Richard Allen, and they did not lead to his arrest. And therefore, for this prosecution, these investigative tools are irrelevant. The defense, as you pointed out, said no, they are relevant, but the judge sided with the prosecution, and they will not be coming in at trial.
Mike King, in all your years in law enforcement and seeing trials happen with defendants at the defense table, do sketches typically come in at trial?
Well, if the sketch leads to a witness coming forward and saying, I saw that guy and he looks like my brother-in-law, that becomes a whole lot more important. But I think we have to put this in perspective too, Julia. When I think back on this, I think that was going through a series of time when they were thinking about an Anthony Schatz, if you remember, and whether Keegan Kline was tied to this. And you wonder sometimes, at least I find myself wondering, if law enforcement wasn't floating a little bit of a trial balloon as they put out this kind of information. The other thing I think about is we still don't know today, although I don't believe it's true, whether there were other people involved in these homicides. And could they have had multiple witnesses who saw people that looked differently? In effect, putting more than one person at the scene. That doesn't mean that Richard Allen did it, but it doesn't mean that he didn't do it either. And so I think we have to take each of these with a grain of salt, and we have to look at the timeline of when they're released, why they're released, and now law enforcement and the prosecution are in a position where they can start to reveal what their hand was, where they can say, here's why I was holding this card close to the vest, and it may have been to shake somebody up, to see if somebody would do something. They could have had something going on where they were monitoring a social media account and they wanted to see what happened when they put that up. There could be 1,000 different reasons, but from my perspective, it's just a bunch of noise when people say this proves that it couldn't be this individual or that individual, or this is something that has to be entered in.
Barbara, Mike mentions the question of whether there was more than one person. There were 2 girls. This seemingly happened in a short amount of time, if you believe the timeline that's been laid out. So tell me about if there's any evidence or if the defense is able to put in front of this jury this allegation that perhaps there was someone else.
I think that's something that the defense is certainly going to argue, is that what happened out there, given the terrain, given what was found at the crime scene, that it would have taken one person a very long time to have done all of that. According to the state's timeline of this case, Richard Allen abducted these girls at 2:13 p.m. and then by 3:30, 4 o'clock, he was getting out of there and it was all over and done with. Over the years, as I have talked to law enforcement officers and investigators, they have kind of wondered, could there be more than one person involved? Was it one person? Was it 2? We also found out in opening statements that there were 2 different murder weapons involved. And so that could lead many people to believe that it had to have been 2 different people to have committed this crime. So that's something the defense is very likely to really play up as we proceed through this case. But the state, they have said, we believe it was one person. We believe that one person is Richard Allen.
Let's talk about those opening statements. Allen's defense attorney, Andrew Baldwin, told the jury this, that 2 days ago, law enforcement is, quote, scrambling a bit. There was a strand of hair found around her finger. And this case was messed up from the beginning. Evidence was lost. It is gone. Mike King, let me ask you first, what do you think they mean by the law enforcement scrambling in this case? We know that was pretty big information, that there's a strand of hair found in the hands of one of the victims and it doesn't match Richard Allen.
Yeah, so I have a hard time believing law enforcement found out 2 days ago there was a strand. The thing that I see happening is that someone dismissed it as not being tied to the crime or being that important, or it got bagged during the collection process at the crime scene or in the morgue. And during that autopsy, it was placed and put away, and there was so many things happening that it got overlooked. I think when they say law enforcement scrambling, I think they are scrambling right now because they're saying, hey, we can nip this one in the bud if we find something that ties this person to this hair to another family member, or we can identify where the hair originates, because there are so many places that hair could have come from. And you have to think about this from the perspective of looking at a crime scene. There are times when things drop onto a victim in a crime scene, especially if that victim is covered in blood and the blood's starting to get a little tacky, where things could affix. That could have been affixed as a rescue operation was in place, where somebody was checking to see if there's a pulse. And kind of hard to imagine, given the gravity of what we heard the condition of those girls was at the time. But there are so many ways.
That's going to be big in this case. Mike King and Barbara McDonald, we do have to go, but thank you for lending your expertise. This is a case that's been shrouded in secrecy from the beginning. The investigators have kept quiet. They've shared very little information with the public, and the judge overseeing this case isn't allowing the public to watch it on television or on the internet. The problem is, when there's no transparency and people are already questioning whether the right man has been arrested, it can create more distrust. Will the public trust this verdict once the jury reaches it? I'm Julia Jenaé in for Vinnie Politan. We'll keep digging for answers and following this investigation as it continues.